I heard you don't want to go to therapy. And I totally get it, I really do. Therapy can be expensive and time-consuming, and it's only for the crazy people, right? Well, it is time-consuming, and copays can definitely add up, not to mention if you're without insurance right now. But as you guys know, if you've watched any of my other videos, I do believe that trauma-informed therapy is for anyone who's open to it, because we've all been through at least one adverse experience that has left us with maladaptations, and usually several. But for someone who's dead set against therapy, or someone who doesn't have access to it right now, what are the alternatives? Is it possible to heal without a therapist? Stay tuned, because that's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. If you're new to the channel or haven't yet had a chance to join this community all about emotional and financial well-being, do that now before we get started. Just click the little red subscribe button and click the bell beside it to be notified every time that we release a new video. Also be sure to click like so it helps others find the video. So the short answer to the question I just asked, is it possible to heal without a therapist, is yes, sometimes. And like I said already, you guys know if you've watched any of my videos that I believe trauma-informed therapy is the faster, safer, stronger route. But over the lifetimes, there have been people who have achieved inner healing without going to a therapist, using a variety of techniques. Today, we're going to talk about just one of those. It's the single best method I've ever heard of after years of reading hundreds of books and going through many, many courses. I'm sure a few of you will be able to guess the name of the method that I'm referring to, so I'm going to wait till the end to give the name of it, and that way you can put it in the comments as soon as it pops into your head, so we'll make a fun little trivia out of today's video. The good news is I'm creating a quick start companion guide to go along with this video, which is mainly for those who don't want to go through the process completely alone. So it's kind of like this happy medium between going to therapy or doing this 100% alone. So I'll be sure to put a link for that in the description at the end of the video. But first, let's talk about the method. How do you heal without a therapist? Especially given the fact that most of our wounds come from childhood, and the adverse experiences that we have as adults tend to serve just as triggers of those old childhood wounds. There are, of course, exceptions to that, where acutely traumatizing things happen to us in adulthood that have nothing to do with our original wounds. The cool part about the method I'm discussing today is it doesn't matter if your wounds formed in childhood or last month. It works for both. But let's first talk about what a childhood wound is. A childhood wound or trauma is any adverse experience that happened to us before the age of 18 that caused some level of separation with our authentic self, others, or the environment, but usually a combination of those three. When we experience trauma in childhood and beyond, it fractures the unity between mind, body, and soul. So how does this happen? When we start out as newborn infants, we're whole. We're able to give and receive love freely. We're able to form attachments and bonds with people and things. But then when adverse experiences occur, and adverse experiences can be anything like rejection, abandonment, betrayal, emotional abuse, physical abuse, loss of a loved one, broken bonds, etc. When these things occur, especially in childhood, the fracture between mind, body, and soul sends the person into this state of emotional chaos, causing them to feel things like confusion, loneliness, apathy, boredom, emptiness, loneliness, and also causing them to form false beliefs about themselves, shameful things like, I'm a bad person because this happened to me, I'm unlovable, I'm worthless, I have no value, I have no future, etc. And that's why it causes the fracture, because if part of you is bad, you're going to naturally want to push that part away from you and disconnect with it or suppress it. Disconnection seems like the only solution. So then there's this semi-permanent fracture or separation between mind, body, and soul. And that fracture is extremely painful. So in order to keep you from being overwhelmed by it, your psyche pushes that fracture, that wound, that pain down into a subconscious or intrinsic level of your body. So that way you're able to go on with life and just survive and get through it without being completely incapacitated by the pain. Then the psyche creates what's called a protective self by some, and the sole job of protective self is to keep you from ever experiencing that pain buried deep within ever again. So the pain is still there, but you now have a protective self who is making sure that you never have to think about it or feel it again if possible. Which has pros and cons. Staying disconnected from the pain keeps you from being overwhelmed by it, but it also keeps you disconnected from your authenticity, which is where you can generate things like happiness, a sense of well-being, wholeness. And instead, you have to start relying on external sources for your sense of worth and your validation and your happiness. Protective self thinks he has a job for life, and so he'll keep us disconnected and buffered from the pain of childhood wounds for as long as we continue to allow it. The problem with that is our bodies and minds weren't designed to carry around childhood trauma with us for a lifetime. And the longer we go without facing it, the more trouble it causes us, and this is what leads to the compounding effects listed in the ACEs pyramid that I talked more about in this video, and one of those effects is pain and disease in the body. But protective self doesn't know about any of that. He just knows his job is to keep you from feeling the pain. So something that started out as helpful protection to get you through childhood is now the biggest hindrance to healing emotionally, mentally, and physically. And I have to tell you, protective self is a creative genius when it comes to strategies to keep us disconnected from that pain and trauma. And its main strategy is to keep you focused on external things like people and relationships, drugs, addictions, shopping, work, success, ideas, kids, food, religion, spirituality, causes. Like, I could sit here all day listing things, but you get the picture. Even therapy can become merely a source of external validation if used improperly. So all of these things just serve as supply for the protective self. If it can keep you focused on external things, far away from the pain buried deep within, its mission is successful. And if it starts to fail, even slightly, it will amp up its efforts, throwing everything but the kitchen sink at you just to keep you back on track of staying away from the pain and focused externally. It actually sounds sort of helpful, right? Who wants to feel pain? The thing is, the only way to heal is to face the trauma and pain buried deep within. So you probably heard the expression, you must exit through the wound, and unfortunately, that's true. So again, once we're adults, protective self becomes a hindrance because it keeps us stuck with trauma from long ago. And like I said earlier, every trauma that we experienced contained false messages about ourselves, lies basically, but lies that we believe because we didn't know any better. And the reason we believe them is because those painful messages came from people that we trusted. When we're young, we tend to openly trust people with little discernment. So we rely on these people to basically tell us who we are. So when those people are toxic, the messages that they convey to us are toxic. So in this method of healing that we're talking about today, the steps to healing are, number one, to become aware of protective self and pull the plug on the many schemes that he tries to play and pull on us to keep us from experiencing the pain. Number two, to resist the many invitations that protective self sends us to avoid pain. Number three is to stay with uncomfortable feelings, which are protective self's disguises for the pain, and we're going to talk about what those are in a few minutes. Number four, to see pain as an entry point to healing. And number five is to learn to stay with that pain as well, even though it deeply hurts. And I'll explain how to do this where it's easier to take. Number six is to uncover the hidden messages in the pain and diffuse them with unconditional love and acceptance. And then number seven is just to repeat steps 1 through 6 until they become a way of life, which is how habits are formed. Sounds simple enough, right? But not necessarily easy, especially step 5, because we instinctively want to move away from pain. But in order to get the healing needed to move past the traumas and to dissolve maladaptations that are the cause of most adult issues and stresses, it's necessary. So let's quickly break these down one by one just to make sure that we're clear. So number 1 was to become aware of protective self and its techniques. And just by watching this video, you now know that you have a protective self. But just knowing isn't enough. To become aware of it, we need to learn how it operates in us. And that looks a little bit different for every person. One of protective self's common traits that I kind of already talked about is that it keeps us focused on external sources of love and acceptance and validation and sense of worth, etc. And it uses tricky little things like boredom, numbness, loneliness, and emptiness to get us to focus on external things. So let's use boredom as an example because it's one of the most common and obvious tactics. When we feel bored, what is our natural response or impulse? It's to go find things to do so that we're not bored anymore. But here's where this gets interesting, because guess what's hiding right behind that uncomfortable sensation or feeling of boredom? If you guessed pain, you're right. All the pain from that childhood trauma that contains those false messages about ourselves. And again, those are lies, but as long as we stay distracted from the pain that contains those messages, that's what we're going to continue to believe about ourselves on a subconscious level. Terrible things like, I'm worthless, I'm inadequate, I'm never going to be successful, I'm doomed in relationships. No one could ever possibly love someone like me, etc. So steps 2 and 3 in this method of healing are to resist the urges to medicate those feelings of loneliness and boredom and numbness and emptiness, and to stay with those uncomfortable feelings instead. And like I warned you, protective self is going to try to work overtime to keep you from doing this. So you have to make a conscious decision to stay with those uncomfortable feelings that I just mentioned and allow what's beneath them to surface. And these can be really painful things like sadness, grief, anger, resentment, rage, etc. The best way to stay with those uncomfortable feelings is to take the standpoint of like a non-judgmental observer, just like you would as if a friend was going through the feelings. So you'll just kind of observe and notice, okay, so I'm feeling bored right now, and I would normally try to find something to entertain or busy myself with so I didn't have to feel that uncomfortable feeling of boredom. And then when you stay with the feeling long enough, then you'll start to let the other feelings rise to the surface, the painful feelings, which brings us to step 4, which is to remember and believe that pain is the entry point to healing. And this is a really important step, because if you don't fully believe that pain is going to lead you to healing, you're going to find it very easy to fall for protective self's many distractions and continue to focus on external sources for validation, love, and happiness. And then steps 5 and 6, in the same way that you kind of stay with those feelings, the uncomfortable feelings of boredom, emptiness, loneliness that brought you to the pain, it's important to stay with the pain in a very similar way, where you are the observer and you're not judgmental towards yourself, and you're just kind of noticing what you're feeling. I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling resentful. I'm feeling angry. I'm feeling disappointed. I'm feeling crushed. I'm feeling grieved. Whatever the feelings are, just notice them, because then step 6 is where you start to find the messages hidden in those painful feelings, which can be the messages like, I'm worthless, and no one loves me, no one could ever love me, never been loved, whatever it may be. Those messages are hidden in those feelings of pain. Those are the lies that have been buried inside, and those lies have been influencing every decision and every life choice that you've made all along the way. We choose friends, romantic partners, cars, houses, jobs, careers, locales, all based on how we feel about ourselves, what we believe about ourselves. So the way to dissolve these lies, these false beliefs about ourselves, is to offer yourself unconditional love and truth in place of those lies. Because the truth is that no one is worthless. It does not matter what you've done, where you came from, what you look like, how much money you have, where you live. None of those things matter. We have intrinsic value just because we're a human. It has nothing to do with external factors. It doesn't matter what other people think of you. It doesn't even matter what you think of yourself. You still have worth. That intrinsic worth is something that we're born with, and once we're born with it, it can't be taken away. You have the intrinsic right to be treated with respect, to be loved, to be cared for, and honestly, that starts with you dissolving these lies about how worthless you are, or how inadequate, or whatever, and starting to love and care for yourself, because the way that we treat ourselves is the way that others treat us. That is a secret that a lot of people don't know. We expect other people to love and care for us, but inside we have these awful messages and thoughts about ourselves. So what happens is we attract people who think and believe the same way about us as we believe about ourselves. There's all this talk out there about self-care and self-love, but the biggest hindrance to those things are those horrible hidden messages inside us that are buried in the pain and disguised by those uncomfortable feelings that protective self works 24/7 to try to keep us distracted from. So if one of your goals for this year is to be better at self-care or self-love, you've come to the right place, the right video. And the way to get there is to go through the pain to get to the other side of those lies. That's where self-love lives. If you try to do it any other way, that's just protective self distracting you and keeping you focused on the wrong things. So the method I've been talking about today, and some of you may have already guessed this, I'm going to check the comments later to see who got the answer right before I got to the finish, but it's based on Jackson Mackenzie's book called Whole Again, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It came out last year, and I've read so many books, but this is honestly on my top 10 list, and definitely the best if you want to heal without going to a therapist. And he goes into so much more detail than we've been able to cover in this one video, so much more. So if you're a reader, I'm telling you, go get the book. You will send me a message thanking me later. One of my favorite quotes from the book is, You've been trying so hard for so long. I know none of this is your fault, but you're the only one who can do the hard work to change it. There is a way back to yourself, to the freedom you seek. It saddens me because a lot of people who have childhood trauma are just perceived as having mental disorders or personality disorders, when really a lot of us have pain from childhood and emotional wounds. And these people are just written off, when the truth is everyone has emotional issues, even if it's just one or two that they've somehow learned how to disguise as strengths. Like workaholism being disguised as, oh, I'm a really hard worker, I like to do a good job, or people pleasing disguised as, oh, I just like to take care of people and make sure everyone's okay. Those are maladaptations. Both of those are. And those are caused by childhood trauma. Those are adaptations that we learned to take on just to survive childhood. So everybody needs inner healing on some level. What I found when I started out on my own journey of healing is that it was really difficult to apply these steps of healing on a consistent, regular basis because life is so distracting. Like literally, there are dozens of things every single day that can keep my mind going from one thing to the next without ever stopping to feel uncomfortable feelings. I literally felt like I didn't have enough time in the day to do these exercises, and I didn't have an accountability partner to kind of remind me to do these every single day. But once I got really mindful about it and purposeful about the process, I had more breakthrough in the first month or two than I had had in a few years of doing other forms of self-care and self-love and all of that. Experts say it takes 90 days to do something regularly and routinely in order to form a habit where you practice this same thing on a subconscious level and kind of do it as like second nature. So I've created a companion guide so that way it prompts and reminds you to do the exercises every single day for 90 days, and that way it becomes a habit and these steps become second nature. I'm putting a link in the description so that way if you want to get started on healing today, you can. Hopefully you found the information we discussed today useful, and if you did, please give the video a like and also make sure to leave a comment, and you can feel free to ask questions there, especially if I left something hanging or didn't fully explain something. I'd also love to connect with you on social media, so feel free to visit my Facebook page, Leah Theobald, and you can either comment or message there so that we can connect. I'll put a link in the description so that the page is easier to find. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!